In our last video, Jeremy did a great job of showing us exactly what to ask, what to expect, and the benefits of working with the right software provider for successful implementations. Today, we are going to talk about modifications and how they can drag a successful implementation down. Hi, Jeremy. So Open Sky Group is known for its no modification policy. Before we dive into that, can you tell us what exactly modifications are?
Yeah, it's a fun question always. Everybody seems to have a different interpretation of what a modification is. A modification is when you change the software to behave differently than the way it was intended to function. By changing the software to act differently, ultimately you're changing the code base of the software. When you do that, it's no longer recognizable by those that support the software and implement the software. You need to make sure that you're changing the software within the confines of a base product only, as to not make that software unrecognizable and unsupportable long-term.
So that's what a modification is. I mean, it's really good for us non-techies to know some of the technical lingo moving forward into a successful implementation. So now that we know what it is, why are modifications such a challenge to technology implementation?
Modifications can be extremely challenging, not only during an implementation, but also during the support of a product. A lot of companies are coming to us just looking to get away from modifications they did 10 or 15 years ago. I like to think of a software code base as a very fragile ecosystem. Anytime you introduce a small modification, it changes the landscape of the entire ecosystem potentially. Without getting too technical, software is very intermingled in terms of code. So if I change a code over here, I could be potentially impacting code other places in that software. And ultimately what that leads to is a lot of challenges in overall maintenance. I've seen this spiral out of control in some companies where they'll make a change and then later realize that that change impacted something. So they'll make another change and then realize that there's cascading effects from that and have several other changes. It becomes a minefield of modifications throughout your code base. You know, in a lot of ways, I think of it as that visual of someone plugging holes in a boat to keep it from sinking. I plug a leak over here and there's another one over there. Ultimately, my IT departments end up spreading across an entire boat, plugging all kinds of holes. Companies are coming up to us simply to get out of that sinking ship.
I've also heard that implementation without modifications is almost impossible. So what is it that Open Sky Group does differently that allows you to offer your clients no modifications 100% of the time?
From the moment we meet you as a client, we're going to begin with a no modifications approach. We're not going to surprise you somewhere in a project by going, oh no, we don't do modifications. You'll know from the moment you meet us that we are not interested in modifying a software. And so ultimately, we're going to begin your project with that approach, and we're going to continue that approach throughout. A big piece that enables us to do that is a word called extensibility. So just to explain that a bit, a software does allow extensions within its core product. This allows you to maybe flex the software to fit a customer's need. Most software companies are aware that a software isn't a one-size-fits-all model. You're going to need some flexibility in sizing that software to a customer's specific fit. And so the way we do that is by using the extensibility of the software, allowing us to build a dashboard where necessary, or maybe a different functionality within a screen while not changing that code base. And so ultimately, you still have a supportable product, you still have an upgradable product. However, it's done within the extensibility model of that software. So I can extend it. I can allow you to have the dashboard, the visibility you need, and still take advantage of product upgrades.
Finally, why don't you tell us what are the top 3 things that companies need to have in place before the implementation that will help to reduce the amount of modifications?
So first things first, you need to have ground rules in place. You need to be able to establish throughout your organization what you will and will not accept in terms of changes. I always like to think that a go-live, what we do, implementing a project, is an event. Use that to your advantage. Everybody's aware you're doing something new. So now's the time to change your process. Talk with your operations team, talk with your IT team, understand that they're interdependent upon each other, and know that maybe a little flexibility on one side will lead to the lack of a modification requirement on the other side. And so establish those ground rules with your leaders early. Make sure they know why you're establishing these ground rules and stick to those throughout a project. Secondly, and this really is a carryover from the first one, is you need to have gatekeepers in place. This may sound like an exaggeration, but any change to the product needs to go through a steering committee type process. You need to make sure that every change that you're making to a software is warranted and cannot be circumvented or worked around or maybe avoided with some compromise. Make sure your leaders within your organization are the ones that are really vetting these changes and absolutely making sure they're a requirement of yours. And lastly, remain open-minded. You have to be flexible and understand what is making you different. Softwares today were implemented and built based on best practices. So if you need to change that product, it's likely because you're doing something outside of a best practice. Why is that? Is it truly an advantage, or is it just that's the way we've always done it? Make sure you're asking those questions and remaining open-minded about your processes.
So I believe that Jeremy has done a great job of outlining what a modification really is, how they challenge technology implementations, and finally, 3 things to have in place to ensure a reduction in modifications. Stay tuned for our next video as we go through the steps to ensure training goes smoothly.